My name is Vaisora, and for 6 weeks, I held the rank of Senior Medical Observer aboard the long-haul transit vessel Cradle of Tooth. And in that time, I learned something about the species we had contracted for outer rim labor that I have not been able to put down since. You have to understand what the crossing does to us first. A 6-week transit between systems is not survived by will. It is survived by rotation. Our physiology cannot sustain conscious cognition past roughly 19 hours without the kind of degradation that shows up first as irritability, then as tremor, then as a slow collapse of judgment that no amount of discipline can outrun. So we sleep in shifts. Stasis cycled, staggered, every officer mandated off the duty roster for 8 hours of every 24. No exceptions. The ship's own system's locking out a console if your fatigue index crosses the line. It is not a rule we resent. It is a rule that keeps the ship in one piece. I have seen what happens to a crew that breaks it. On an older posting, early in my service, a transport captain pushed the rotation by 2 extra hours a cycle to make up a navigation delay. By the 11th day, the helm officer was reading numbers off a console that had been powered down for an hour. By the 14th, 2 crew members were in restraints, not from injury, but from a kind of waking confusion our physiology has no defense against once the threshold is crossed. We built the lockouts because of postings like it, and we trust them the way you trust a hull seal. Not because we like the restriction, but because we have watched what happens when it fails. So when I came aboard the Cradle of Tooth for this crossing, the rotation board was the first thing I checked, the way I always do, scanning down the names for anyone running close to the line. The contractor's name was Daniel Okafor. Human, mid-30s by his own species reckoning, hired through one of the labor consortiums that supply skilled hands for vessels like ours when our own crew complement runs short. He held a watch-standing certification, navigation, and systems monitoring, nothing exotic. I noted him on my first day only because the roster software kept flagging an anomaly next to his name, and I assumed, reasonably, that the software was wrong. It said he had not slept, not in the way our systems mean it. He slept. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only thing I have to offer you. He slept in short windows for hours, sometimes 5, scattered through what he called his day, and then he returned to the duty roster and volunteered for the open watch. Again, every cycle, the fatigue lockout never engaged on his console because his fatigue index never crossed the line that would trigger it. I assumed the sensor cradle in his bunk was miscalibrated. I had it checked twice. It was not miscalibrated. I pulled 3 weeks of his biometric log on the 14th day, expecting to find the slow creep we see in every species before collapse. The cortisol drift, the reaction time lag, the small telltale errors that show up in a transit log an hour before someone has to be relieved by force. I found almost none of it. There was a dip, modest, around hour 20 of any stretch he pushed past his own sleep windows, and then a leveling. Not a recovery, a floor. As though his mind had a basement it could simply stand on indefinitely. Instead of a cliff, it eventually walked off. I brought it to my superior, Fleet Surgeon Onrith Voss, who has logged 11 of these crossings and has the kind of patience that comes from having seen most things twice. She looked at the log for a long while before she spoke. "Run it again," she said. "Assume the instrument is lying to you." I ran it again. The instrument was not lying to me. We decided, between the two of us, that the correct scientific posture was to watch, not to ask. Asking a subject changes the subject. So for the next 10 days, we simply watched Daniel Okafor the way you would watch any anomaly worth understanding. Quietly, continuously, without comment, logging everything and saying nothing to him beyond the ordinary courtesies of shipboard life. He took his meals in the common mess. He spoke little. He was by every account from the crew who worked beside him, unremarkable, competent, polite, the kind of presence you forget is there until you need him. On the 22nd day of transit, the ship needed him. A coupling fault in the secondary alignment drive announced itself at the worst possible hour, deep into the stretch where 4 of our 5 senior watch officers were locked into mandatory stasis cycle and could not be roused without triggering a withdrawal cascade that would have taken them out of useful service for the better part of the day. The 5th was Onrith Voss herself, and she was needed in the medical bay within minutes because the fault had thrown a pressure transient through 2 decks, and we had injuries: a fractured wrist, a crewman thrown against a bulkhead hard enough to need scanning for internal bleeding, the ordinary chaos of a ship that has just felt itself shudder in a way it was never built to shudder. That left the helm, for a window of just under 3 hours, in the hands of whoever was already on the open watch. It was Okafor. I was not on the bridge. I was in a medical bay, scanning the crewman's ribs for fractures that, mercifully, were not there, and listening to the comm feed because I could not make myself stop listening. I heard the alignment officer's voice, thin with the early stage of forced wakefulness, trying to walk Okafor through a procedure that officer had trained on for 6 years and could no longer hold steady in his own mouth. The words slurring at the edges the way ours do, in our species, in the first hour past the threshold before the real collapse sets in. I heard Okafor ask 2 clarifying questions, calm, almost bored, the kind of voice you'd use asking someone to pass the salt. I heard him read the coupling diagnostics back correctly on the first try. No hesitation, no request to repeat. I heard him execute a manual override sequence that our own systems are built to require 2 licensed officers to authorize, and do it alone, because there was no one else awake to be the second signature, and the ship was losing alignment faster than the automated correction could compensate. The transient kept building. I could feel it through the floor of the medical bay, a low shudder that did not stop for the better part of an hour, while Okafor talked the secondary drive back into its housing 1 correction at a time, alone, on a console that had killed entire crews on older ships when nobody was left coherent enough to finish the repair. 3 hours. No relief possible. No second officer. A coupling fault that has killed entire watch rotations on older vessels when the crew burned out mid-repair and lost the thread. He held it the whole time. When Onrith Voss finally reached the bridge, the fault was already isolated and the drive was realigning on its own corrected curve, and Okafor was sitting at the console finishing a status log in a hand that did not shake. She asked him, because by then asking seemed less dangerous than not knowing, how he had managed 3 hours of crisis-grade cognition on top of 19 days of partial sleep. He told her, and I will give you his words exactly as they were logged, because I have never been able to improve on them. I used to do longer than this for less reason. That was the whole answer. He did not elaborate, and she did not press him, and the watch rotation closed out the rest of the crossing without further incident, because the fault had been the only thing wrong with the ship. Everything else that was wrong, we kept to ourselves. I have filed my full report with the consortium's medical liaison, and I expect it to be read by perhaps 3 people and then archived, because that is the fate of most reports. But I want it on some record, even if only this one, that we built an entire ship's survival architecture around the assumption that consciousness has a hard limit, that every crew of every species we have ever crossed deep space with eventually has to put its mind down and rest or break. We built fatigue locks. We built mandatory stasis cycles. We built redundancy into every console specifically because we know, with total confidence, that no one stands a watch forever. We did not build anything for a species that apparently disagrees. I do not know what Daniel Okafor's people did to themselves, or had done to them by their own history, that left a man able to stand alone at a failing console for 3 hours on 19 days of partial sleep and call it unremarkable. I only know that when I asked Onrith Voss, off the record, whether we should flag the anomaly for further study before our next contract renewal with the human consortium, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said we should not flag it. She said if this was ordinary for them, she did not want to know what they considered exceptional. I have thought about that answer every day since the crossing ended. I think about it now, filing this. Somewhere out past our charted lanes, there is a species that ships its tired men out to the rim to stand the watches the rest of us cannot hold, and calls it just a job, and goes home and sleeps 4 hours and does it again. We have a name for crews who can't be put down. We did not, until Okafor, have a name for a man who simply wouldn't be.